Today we are going to read about Plato. He is one of the most dazzling writers in the Western literary tradition and one of the most penetrating, wide ranging, and influential authors in the history of philosophy. An Athenian citizen of high status, he displays in his works his absorption in the political events and intellectual movements of his time. But the questions he raises are so profound, and the strategies he uses for tackling them so richly suggestive and provocative that educated readers of nearly every period have in some way been influenced by him. And in practically every age, there have been philosophers who count themselves Platonist in some important respect. Plato's central doctrines. Though the world the world that appears to our senses is in some way defective and filled with error, but there is a more real and perfect realm, populated by entities called forms or ideas, that are eternal, changeless, and in some sense paradigmatic for the structure and character of the world presented to our senses. Among the most important of these abstract objects, as they are now called because they are not located in space or time, are goodness, beauty, equality, bigness, likeness, unity, being, sameness, difference, change, and changelessness. These terms, goodness, beauty, and so on, are often capitalized by those who write about Plato in order to call attention to their exalted status, similarly for forms and ideas. Plato's puzzles. Often Plato's works exhibit a certain degree of dissatisfaction and puzzlement with even those doctrines that are being recommended for our consideration. For example, the forms are sometimes described as hypotheses. See, for example, Phaedo, the form of good in particular, is described as something of a mystery whose real nature is elusive and as yet unknown to anyone at all. See Republic. Puzzles are raised and not overtly answered about how any of the forms can be known and how we are to talk about them without falling into contradiction. See Parmenides, or about what it is to know anything. See Theaetetus, or to name anything. See Cratylus. Dialogue setting character. Plato's dialogues do not try to create a fictional world for the purposes of telling a story, as many literary dramas do, nor do they invoke an earlier mythical realm like the creations of the great Greek tragedians Achilles, Sophocles, and Euripides, nor are they all presented in the form of a drama. In many of them, a single speaker narrates events in which he participated. They are philosophical discussions, debates, would in some cases also be an appropriate word, among a small number of interlocutors, many of whom can be identified as real historical figures, and often they begin with a depiction of the setting of the discussion, a visit to a prison, a wealthy man's house, a celebration over drinks, a religious festival, a visit to the gymnasium, a stroll outside the city's wall, a long walk on a hot day. As a group, they form vivid portraits of a social world and are not purely intellectual exchanges between characterless and socially unmarked speakers. Socrates. Presence of Socrates in Plato's dialogues. Socrates is a central figure in nearly all of Plato's dialogues, except in Laws, which is one of Plato's latest works. Socrates, like other characters in Plato's works, example Crito, Gorgias, Thrasymachus, Laches, was a real person and not an invention of Plato. Socrates was also depicted by other authors who knew him personally, such as Aristophanes and Xenophon. Aristophanes portrayed him in the comedy Clouds, and Xenophon wrote works including an apology of Socrates. Besides Plato and Xenophon, other contemporaries of Socrates also wrote dialogues describing conversations with Socrates. Plato's dialogues featuring Socrates contributed to a genre inspired by Socrates' life and participated in a literary debate about Socrates' character and intellectual conversations. Aristophanes' Clouds provides a critical comic portrayal of Socrates depicting him and other intellectuals of the 420s BC negatively. Plato, Xenophon, and other composers of Socratic discourses from the 390s onward after a more favorable portrayal of Socrates. The intact works of Aristophanes, Xenophon, and Plato are crucial in shaping our conception of Socrates. Aristophanes' Clouds has limited value in understanding Socrates' philosophy, focusing more on a stereotypical philosophical type rather than Socrates himself. Xenophon's portrayal, while potentially valuable as historical testimony, lacks the philosophical depth found in Plato's works. Reading Plato's dialogues is essential not just for understanding Socrates but for engaging with Plato as a significant philosopher. Scholars agree that Plato was not merely transcribing Socrates' words. While influenced by Socrates, Plato's dialogues reflect his own philosophical ideas. Plato's use of Socrates in his dialogues serves more than just preserving his teacher's lessons. It showcases Plato's own philosophical contributions. Plato's indirectness. Socrates does not appear in all of Plato's works, being absent in Laws and having minor roles in Sophist, Statesman, and the Timaeus. Plato's dialogues vary in topic, speakers, and the use of questions and answers. Notably, Plato never wrote philosophical treatises, unlike his contemporaries, preferring dialogue form, which he constantly adapted. Throughout his career, he avoided directly addressing his audience in his own voice, instead communicating through his characters. Even in his controversial letters, the author opposes writing philosophical books, reinforcing Plato's preference for indirect communication through dialogue. Can we know Plato's mind? Plato's works raise questions about how to interpret his writing since he does not directly affirm anything in his dialogues. This has led to debates about whether we can attribute philosophical doctrines to Plato himself or only to his characters. Plato never wrote treatises, preferring dialogues that varied in form and content. His indirect communication through characters encourages readers to consider their arguments' possibility. Understanding Plato's intentions involves interpreting the dialogue's content and purpose. His works aim to induce reflection and acceptance of certain philosophical ideas, serving as supplementary aids to philosophical conversation, not authoritative texts. Socrates as the dominant speaker. Plato likely uses Socrates as a dominant speaker in his dialogues to persuade his contemporary audience, many of whom admired Socrates, of the arguments presented. The historical Socrates' intellectual brilliance and moral passion would enhance the character's persuasive power. Plato's admiration for Socrates and indebtedness to his philosophical techniques further justify this choice. Alternative explanations like undermining Socrates' reputation are impossible given the positive portrayal of Socrates in works like Meno, Phaedo, Republic, and Phaedrus. Plato's dialogues encourage readers to accept Socrates' arguments as powerful and deserving serious consideration, reflecting Plato's own positive evaluation of them. The historical Socrates, early, middle, and late dialogues. Many contemporary scholars believe Plato began his philosophical writing career with works like the Apology of Socrates and short ethical dialogues. These early dialogues, such as Charmides, Crito, and Gorgias, focus on Socrates, exposing his interlocutors' inability to define ethical terms or justify their moral beliefs, showcasing Socrates' intellectual and moral superiority. These works lack extensive metaphysical or epistemological speculation and align with Aristotle's depiction of Socrates as an ethical philosopher who asked definitional questions without providing answers. As Plato's writing evolved, he began incorporating his own philosophical ideas using the character Socrates to present them in dialogues like Phaedo and Meno. Socrates explores methodological and metaphysical topics, reflecting Plato's growing intellectual independence. Plato continued to write dialogues that both critiqued false beliefs and developed substantive theories, combining these approaches throughout his career. Plato's later works, including Sophist, Statesman, Timaeus, and Laws, exhibit stylistic affinities and complex philosophical content, indicating his mature thought. These dialogues often feature characters other than Socrates aligning with their specialized topics. Scholars debate the exact chronological order of Plato's works and whether they represent distinct development stages. Nonetheless, it is evident that Plato consistently blended his philosophical innovations with the Socratic method, creating dialogues that provoke thought and encourage the pursuit of knowledge. Thank you.